Shirley's here. That's good news.
Yes.
My kids are home for spring break. That's good news. Sammy brought his girlfriend Ella to visit with us. That's good news.
Nice.
They agreed to wash my car later today. That's good news. So thank you guys.
They're just learning this, right?
Yeah, but gospel actually, like in the word gospel comes from sort of a fancy Greek word that in the literal sense it means good news, but in its usage it was a political term. Like it was used when a king would have birth of a new child. There's a new heir to the throne, and there's a grand announcement about that. That is a gospel. If there was a great military victory, that they had conquered a new land and expanded territory, there was a grand announcement about that was seen as gospel. And so gospel is more than just small little tidbits of good news that happen throughout the day. It's like a monumental occasion. It is a momentous announcement. And if you think about the accounts of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's exactly what we're hearing. We're hearing about there's a new king. There's an heir to the throne has arrived. That there's been a great victory over sin and death, which is what Jesus achieved in his life. So that's one of the reasons that these books are called gospel.
Yay.
It's history-changing news. So let's take a look. I want to start out with these four here, and I want to take a poll of what everyone remembers about these gospel authors. So let's start with Matthew. This is our digital flannel board today. You guys bring your flannel board class. So here's Matthew. What do you remember about the person Matthew? Tax collector, yes. What else?
Jewish.
Okay, was it Jew?
He's the youngest. He's the youngest.
I didn't know. He was not the youngest.
He's also called Levi.
Okay, he was one of the two named apostles. So Levi was one of his names. Matthew was the other. That name Matthew means gift of God, which may have been why that name was given to Matthew. So he was one of the 12 apostles. And how about Mark? What do we remember about Mark?
Him and Paul got into it.
He and Paul got into it. Tell me about that.
Well, he was.
Had some arguments?
He didn't set aside Paul's preaching the gospel or whatever. We know we're in Asia.
Okay, so he didn't 100% align with what Paul was saying, is what you're saying?
They
Okay.
separated ways, him and Barnabas.
Right. Mark was actually Barnabas' cousin. And so they would travel together, and then, yes, they parted ways at one point during the mission. What else do we know about Mark?
He seemed to be very energetic. His book is short, to the point, action-oriented.
Okay, great, yeah. When we look at the gospel side by side, Mark is the shortest one, and it is very action-packed. There's a lot of things happening, one right after the other. Anything else?
It's thought to be a protege of Peter.
Okay, yep, he did accompany Peter and learned a lot from him. So Mark was not one of the 12 apostles. So his information, a lot of it came secondhand. So, and a lot of that was from Peter. How about Luke? This looks a little bit like my Luke. Physician, okay. Luke the doctor, yes. What else do we remember about Luke?
He researched before he wrote. He had eyewitness accounts, so apparently in interviews, eyewitnesses before he wrote.
Okay, so he was very meticulous about his data collection. Good. As a physician, he was one of the more educated writers in the Bible. It's sort of, he's regarded as one of the most polished linguists of all the biblical authors. It's very accurate. He has the richest vocabulary of any writer in Scripture. What else did Luke write? Okay, so Luke and Acts are typically regarded as coming from the same author, but we have John right in the middle of those, and there's a reason for that we can talk about. Luke also joined Paul on his second and third missionary journeys, so he did get a lot of information from Paul as well, and was very well educated. How about John? What do we know about little John here?
Looks like a little renegade. He needs a shave.
Beloved
Needs a
apostle.
shave?
He's the beloved apostle.
Okay. He was known as the disciple that Jesus loved. Self-proclaimed, I guess. Anything else? So John was actually the youngest disciple.
His writing is the most unique.
Okay. Unique in what way?
He discusses things that are not found in the other three. He expands on stuff that's not expanded on. It's, I mean, I can go on and on. Like he puts it in different orders than the other three has them in. And sorry, I have a lot of useless information.
No, that's good. Yeah, the majority of John is unique to John. You don't see his stories in the other three.
His Greek's much easier to read.
Okay.
So your information was useless until you got to this class. And now suddenly, now I can use it.
That's right. You might see Josh up here as a guest speaker at some point.
John's also the book that we like.
That we like.
I'm studying.
You don't like the other three.
I like the other, but he touches your heart.
Yes.
Okay.
Because it's just primarily, it's where I am right now. And then when I do Luke, they're all telling the same story,
Mhm.
but it's telling it in a different way. And I tend to like the way John talks and what he expects of people. So it's kind of like when Dave talks and he's saying something, but you don't know that he's saying it. I'm sorry.
A lot of times I don't know that I'm saying.
But it comes across good. That's what I'm saying.
And John wrote some other material as well, right?
Yeah.
We have 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. He's John the Revelator. So a lot of good stuff comes from John. We all have our favorites. Thank you for sharing that, Shirley. I remember when I was, I have our college students in here, so a lot of this is going to sound like Bible classes you've been in, so sorry about that. But I remember when I was a freshman, and in my first Bible class, the professor said, who can name all of the gospel books? And I raised my hand, shot up. I was like, I'm a good Church of Christ kid. I know my gospels. I very confidently said Matthew, Luke, and John. And the professor said, well, son, I'm afraid that you've totally missed the mark.
Well, Shirley mentioned this earlier. Why are there 4 accounts of the same narrative? Why include in the canonized New Testament? Why include 4 accounts of the same information, same story? Why would they do that?
They were written to different audiences.
They were written to different audiences. That's true.
Increases the veracity of the story.
Ooh, good word.
It does increase the veracity, the truthfulness. They validate one another, and because of a lot of the same information. Yeah. If 4 members of your family were to write a factual biography of your life, would all 4 of those biographies be exactly alike? Well, of course not. You know, they would be, you know, people would have different views, even if they were trying to be factual with it. When our family gets together and we recount memories, you know, some people remember details that others have forgotten. To some people, certain memories are more important than others. And it's like sometimes it's not important at all who won and who lost something and what the score was. But sometimes it's very important who won and who lost, depending on what the story is. I always like the ones where I always insert this, you know, you remember I won that game. That's important detail, don't forget that. But each of the Gospels gives a detailed account of Jesus' life, and they all end with a call to believers to continue the story, to continue to spread the story and to give us that.
And it's not really, you know, we call it the New Testament, but it's not necessarily a new story, right? It's a continuation from the Old Testament. So it's not saying Old Testament is gone, now we have a new one. It's all that is written in these four Gospels is all tied to the story of Israel. So you have the coming of Jesus, what he says and does are largely what we see in the accounts of the Gospels, how people respond to him, what he is calling us, his followers, to do. It's all connected all the way back to the Garden of Eden, back to creation. You have the call of Abraham, the story of Moses, the Exodus, the establishment of Israel as a nation. We have their fall to Babylon, the promise of a return, and then the longing of Jewish freedom from oppression. And then this is sort of where the story comes to a climax when Jesus arrives. Like, he is the prophesied one, he's the Messiah, and he is the fulfillment of everything that we've read in the story up until now. And so we asked last week, sort of, how would you describe the times we're living in today? I describe it as the resolution of the story. Like, the climax has occurred, we're living in the resolution. I like how Emily Dolan phrased it last week, how in the Old Testament is sort of the story of God the Father, and then that brings in Jesus the Son in the New Testament, and then the times we're living in today are the times of the Spirit. He's left his Spirit to dwell with us, so until we're called home to be with him.
And it was also said that if the Bible is like a 3-act play, Old Testament was Act 1, the New Testament was Act 2, we're fulfilling Act 3, and then after class, Paul Puckett said, and the intertestamental time, what did you call it?
Intermission.
Yeah, that would be the intermission. To have Act 1, then an intermission, and then the others. So in the canonized New Testament, Matthew comes first, but Matthew was not the first gospel written. Oh, here we go. Yeah, thanks. And Luke says at the beginning of his gospel that he used what Dee said earlier, eyewitnesses and ministers of the word to do his research. It makes sense, since a big chunk, a lot of Matthew and Luke are the same as Mark. That Mark was probably the first gospel written. Mark wrote his first. And it was probably written about, what do you have there, about 62 AD?
Yeah, and this is a timeline I got off the internet, which,
Never lie.
take it with a grain of salt. These are approximate dates. There's no way to know exact dates, but most timelines that you see will be numbers in this range.
So using your best mind reading skills, what story am I thinking of that's found in Matthew and Luke that Mark leaves out? I'm giving it to you, I'm giving it to you. Anybody got it yet? It's the birth. It's the birth of Jesus. Mark just starts right in with the ministry of Jesus. Doesn't include the birth story at all. But evidently Matthew and Luke thought, Mark, you got a good start here, but you left out something important. And we want to include that. Matthew wanted to include the birth story, and Luke wanted to include the birth story. And I appreciate both of those things. But even though those are different, a significant portion of both Luke and Matthew are found in Mark. They did rely on his work fairly heavily. And because of that, these are known as the synoptic gospels. So using your etymological skills, break down that word.
Wait a minute, you mean etymological?
What did I say?
You said entomological, that's the study of insects.
That always bugs me when you correct me. The etymological skills, use that, and then break down the word synoptic. What does that break down to? Why are they called synoptic?
Synopsis? I don't
It's, synopsis is a similar word. What's the sin part? S-Y-N.
Synonym?
Yeah, it means alike, similar, yeah. And then optic,
Looking at.
yeah, look. So when you look at the three gospels, they look alike. There's a lot of things about them that you see in one of the gospels that you can also see in the other two. And John is not part of those synoptic gospels. It's just Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
So here's a fun little breakdown chart. So we have Mark that was written first, and we see so everything's color coded for you. Mark only has 3% of what you read in the book of Mark that is unique to Mark. There's a lot of Mark and Luke, a lot of Mark and Matthew, over 40%. So that is why we think that Luke and Matthew borrowed from Mark, because there's just so much of that is included in their accounts. Then you have 1% in Luke that matches up with Mark and Luke. And then we have, so there's 20% of what Matthew wrote was unique to him, 35% of what Luke wrote was unique to him. Then you have this 25% in Luke and Matthew that match up but are not in Mark. And so that's why you may have heard of this theory of Q, which is an additional source that we don't exactly know what that is. That just comes from the German word, I think it's pronounced quell, but it just means, it's the German word for source. So there's a source out there that Luke and Matthew both found credible and included those in their Gospels. And then Mark and Matthew have some matchup over there as well. So you can see how it all kind of blends together. These are the synoptic Gospels that, it means same eye. You can see the similarities through all of them. And then Shirley's favorite, John, is just totally different. Like he has, I think it's
He's
like
not even in there.
yeah, I think it's like 90% of what John wrote is unique to John. So I do think that it's important to note that you might wonder, well, what if these guys knew what was going on, why didn't they just write their own account, and why were they relying on other people? Well, it was not uncommon to borrow from other writers, and when that occurred, it's not that they were stealing from these other writers and trying to pass it off as their own, or it's not as if they were trying to correct what was written before. It was mainly used as an agreement, a corroboration of saying, yes, this was written before. I'm going to include this in my account as well because I agree with this. This is what happened. And so rather than reinvent the wheel, I'm going to take this. I'm going to veracify, whatever word word you used.
BJ?
So, yeah, Rod.
Also, it might also point to the fact that they all had a similar experience and saw the same thing.
Yeah,
And so it wasn't maybe that they were borrowing from the other one, but they saw that and they included that. And he saw it and he included it.
correct. There's a lot of word for word, like if you look at the actual text, it's so exactly similar that it's hard to say, well, these two guys just wrote from their same experience. But I agree with that. I think what they're doing is they're saying, this was written before, I'm going to include it as well, and maybe even add a few extra bits of my own experience there to go along with the bill.
And the differences could be because of the different audiences that they were writing to also.
Yeah, very good observation.
So we discussed why it was helpful to have 4 different views, 4 different stories about the same thing. But why write it down anyway? You know, why do we need the Gospels? What would make Mark sit down with a quill and a piece of parchment or maybe papyrus and start writing all this stuff out? Why do that?
Kind of important.
It is important. It's important for other people. But up until, Mark started his writing about 62 AD, about a generation after the crucifixion. So for those 30-something years, 30, 40 years, the stories were passed down by oral tradition. You know, they were shared orally in the families and in the churches. And most of the people were expecting Jesus to return just at any time. So for a good amount of time, it wasn't necessary to do anything other than just share the oral traditions of the story of Jesus. But at the time that Mark started writing, a lot of those first-hand eyewitnesses, there fewer and fewer left. And so maybe Mark said, you know what, before long, and maybe some of you have done this as well, that before a generation before you completely disappears, you do some interviews, you ask some questions, you do some recording, and say, I want to get this and save this before it's gone and there's no one left. Paul?
I want to say, I think you said earlier, you don't want it to be forgotten.
Don't want it to be forgotten. Exactly right. That's a good way to put it. Needs to be remembered, so they wrote it down.
That's the same reason, Dave, we had the 100th anniversary,
Yeah.
because there's so few in here that remember, but
There's just a few
it's
of
our,
us that remember.
it is our heritage. So you have people, and if you don't remember, then it's lost. And I can, also Carol did a book, Carol, for her children. And it's an awesome book of her life and her grandmother. If we don't pass it on, it's lost.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they were doing.
Yeah. And I know some other people that have done videos of sort of a legacy video of someone, and they say, you know, hey, Granddad, can you tell that story again? And I want to put it on video so that we'll have it, so that, you know, we can keep that. Well, you know, the Gospels are historical biographies, but they're much more than that. They are Holy Spirit inspired accounts of the life of Jesus, and so it's different from like a historical biography of Abraham Lincoln or something like that. And even though there are hundreds of historical biographies about Abraham Lincoln, and a lot of them have different information in them, it's not the same thing as a gospel. Dave?
My uncle made a big audio tape with my grandmother. There's things I didn't even know
Yeah.
happened back in the turn of the century, and it was kind of interesting.
And with Matthew and Luke, both being eyewitnesses, firsthand accounts. They were able to tell some things, put some things in there that they knew for sure. They had experience. So anyway, it just it's part of relaying information about Jesus's divine authority to bring the mission that he brought.
Who remembers Second Timothy 3:16? Anybody know what that says?
All scriptures, God breathed.
Scripture's God breathed,
Useful
useful for
teaching,
teaching, rebuking, correcting, training in righteousness, so that
Man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished, fully equipped.
fully equipped to do good works. Nice, well done.
And at the bottom it says, and useful for BJ and Dave's class.
That's the footnote, yes. So do the Gospels fit that bill?
Yes. Absolutely.
Being useful for training, equipping, all of that good stuff? I think so. But they do each, as you mentioned, Chris, they have their own unique flavor. They sort of have their own particular style and focus. They can, but I think all four can be described as theology that are written as history and biography. So it's written with a spiritual purpose, but in a historical format about a real living person. That this is, they are writing to persuade us that this actually happened. These are not theories. These are not philosophies. This is history, and therefore, what do we do with it? And so that theology that's written as history and biography, I feel like so the Gospels focus a lot on the what as well as the why, and then the letters that come after in the New Testament, they don't get into the history as much. They don't focus on the what happened. They more sort of look back at the Gospels and say, okay, this happened, the life of Jesus happened, and therefore, why does that matter to us? And so they get a lot more into the why that is connected to the what. And they are all telling the same story. Each author's narrative sort of approaches it from a different viewpoint. And so these naturally will introduce some differences in the account, which has raised questions from believers over the years. That if Scripture is truth, and all Scripture is God-breathed, inspired, where do these differences come from? Why are there some differences? It can largely be attributed to the fact that these individual accounts were written for different audiences and different purposes and different emphases in the writing.
You throwing it to me?
Throwing it to you. What you got?
Well, all four of the Gospels present Jesus as human and talk about how he acts as a human, reacts as a human, those kind of things. But they also, all four, make it completely clear about his divinity, that he was the Son of God, the Jewish Messiah, and that they need to look no farther. They connect Jesus with the Old Testament, with the prophecies. And Jesus does that as well. When Jesus' cousin John was in prison, John sent messengers to Jesus and said, hey, cousin, do we need to keep looking for the Messiah, or are you the one that was sent? Because John believed he was, but he wanted a little bit of verification. And can somebody get Luke 7:22 and just read Jesus' reply to John? What did Jesus say back to John? What was the message that he sent back to John when John said, do we need to look any further?
You said 7:22?
I think so.
And he answered them, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them."
Wow. And does your book there have a footnote where Jesus got those words?
No.
No? Somebody see that? I think he's quoting from Isaiah 35. Isaiah 35 had prophesied that this would happen. And now Jesus is saying, tell John, this is happening. And it's happening through me. That, yes, I am the Messiah. So the three synoptic gospels present their cases for Jesus' humanity and his divine authority together. And they a lot of the words are the same, the sequences are a lot alike. And it's just an example of some of the things that are found in all three synoptic gospels is the baptism of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three describe the baptism of Jesus. And Matthew 3, Mark 1, Luke 3. And the temptation of Jesus in the desert by Satan. That's a story it found in all three synoptic gospels. It's in Matthew 4, Mark 1, Luke 4. The miracle of the loaves and the fishes. That's in all three synoptic gospels. It's even found in John. John tells that story as well. And of course, there'd be no reason to have 3 or 4 identical stories. But the synoptic gospels include enough similar material that gives them validity, but they use different styles and approaches and details to give a fuller, clearer overall picture. They do that in their synopticity. That's a word that's not in the dictionary, but they do it together to give us that picture. But so we get an overall view collectively from what they gave us individually. You take the 4 individual accounts, put them together collectively, just gives a better, clearer picture overall.
And in the 7-ish minutes we have left here, we're gonna buzz through each of these 4 gospels and just kind of talk about some of the purposes of writing. So Matthew comes first in the New Testament. It's, as we said before, it wasn't written first, but it feels like a natural transition from Old Testament to New Testament. It's very organized. It contains a lot of numbers, a lot of measurements, not always included in the other versions of the story. And as a tax collector, Matthew would have been accustomed to keeping very meticulous data. So it fits with his style. Attention to detail is very evident from the first chapter. Matthew traces genealogy from Abraham to Jesus. And then at the end of the list, he even describes the method that he was using for that genealogy. He says, thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile of Babylon, 14 from the exile to the Messiah. So he's very exact in his numbers and record keeping. And so this his writing style sort of connects the apostle of Jesus to Jesus in a very very personal way.
Sounds like an accountant.
Sounds like an accountant, and even his writing style is very sort of amiable and personable, relational. Jesus Christ, the son of David. Mary had been betrothed to Joseph. Before they came together, she was found to be with child. So relationships very important to Matthew. So as we said, natural transition here. Emphasis on fulfillment of the law and prophecy. There are like 11 different times that he says this happened so that this would be fulfilled. The target audience was believed to be Jewish. A lot of the customs and ideas that he talks about in here, he doesn't bother to explain what they are. He just assumes the audience knows what he's talking about, and so it seems to be aimed at Jewish audience. Amiable, persuasive style, organized and structured. Jesus is the Messiah, is the central message, and he's setting up the church as the new chosen nation of God. So it's no longer just for the Jews, it's for everyone.
New kingdom.
New kingdom. Mark, as we mentioned, is the shortest of the Gospels. It's very direct, fast-paced. Carol pointed that out for us. Strong sense of urgency. Like he uses the word immediately or at once, synonyms of that more than 40 times. If you read through Mark, it also almost becomes comical that he starts every paragraph with, immediately this happened. At once, these people did this. So it's very much a man of action.
It was ADHD.
You think he was
He's off his meds.
It does include, there's emphasis on action and immediacy, very much highlighting power and authority of Jesus. The writing is focused a lot more on miracles and then actually fewer accounts of the teachings of Jesus. You'll find missing things like the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, these parables that you see in the other Gospels are missing from Mark. And then his writing did rely on the account of Peter, which Mark sort of paints the disciples in a less favorable light a lot of times. Like as you read through Mark, you might get the sense of these guys weren't that great. And so that part of that we feel like came from Peter, just his kind of downplaying the things that happened, and he didn't want to puff himself up too much. One example of that is in the account of Mark, when Jesus walks on the water, Mark ends that account with, they were all afraid, and Jesus got back into the boat, and their hearts had been hardened because they didn't understand his parables. And that was the end of the story. And then when you read it in Matthew says, oh, but also Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water out to Jesus. And then you had the, you have little faith line. They all get back into the boat and worship. It's just a lot more sort of happy ending to that story. So it's just sort of interesting the different perspectives that these authors have about the same story. So Luke has got a little bit different style from the others, very polished, elegant writing style. You'll notice at the beginning of his book, he addresses Theophilus, which could be a person, could just be, the Theophilus just means lover of, what does it mean?
God.
Lover of God? Yeah, Theophilus, okay. Lover of God, so the audience feels universal. It's not just for Jews, it's not just for Gentiles, it's for everybody. So he's shining a spotlight on the teaching of compassion and forgiveness and love. Sometimes he'll take the portions that are from Mark that he borrows from. He might polish up the language a little bit and be like, okay, that's good, Mark, that you wrote this, but that's maybe not how this would be said in the Greek. So he'll do some of that. Very chronological account, straightforward from beginning to end. He says, here's what happened. I want to organize everything for you, one right after the other. He has receipts for what happens. Highlighting this idea of community, that a new community is being established here, and also importance of the Spirit. And then, I think you got a couple minutes left. John is a very different book.
That was the second bell.
That was the second bell. So you guys will have to study John on your own. But here's some things about John that makes him unique from the other gospel writers. Any conclusion for us?
Well, I would say that Shirley has said her favorite gospel writer is John. I think mine is Luke, just because I really like the birth of Jesus story in Luke, and there are some other things in Luke that I really appreciate. So you may have your own gospel favorite, and we can talk about that another time. So we're out of time, so thanks for being here.
Thanks.
I don't know yet.
Yeah.
They've only been home since 1 in the morning, so.
Starting.